Hey guys, welcome to the Boring History channel. Do subscribe if you're a true history lover and want our content to reach you daily. Also comment where you're watching from and at what time, and suggest any history topic you'd like us to post. We'd love to grow this community together. Dim your lights, and let's dive into an interesting medieval topic tonight. In medieval times, many practices, objects, institutions, and habits were created as short-term fixes for crises like war, disease, religious control, or social instability. Yet they quietly embedded themselves so deeply into daily life that they survived long after the original problem disappeared, shaping the modern world in ways most people never realize. One of the clearest examples is taxation systems. Medieval rulers introduced temporary war taxes to fund crusades, castle construction, or defense against invasions, promising citizens that the burden would vanish once the conflict ended. But those taxes proved too efficient and profitable to abandon, evolving into permanent state taxation models that modern governments still rely on today. Similarly, surnames were initially a temporary solution to confusion in growing medieval towns, used only to distinguish people with the same first name by their profession, location, or parentage. Yet, over generations, these identifiers hardened into hereditary family names that became legally and culturally permanent. Feudal land ownership itself was meant to be a flexible arrangement, where nobles temporarily held land in exchange for military service, but it fossilized into rigid class hierarchies that locked wealth and power into bloodlines for centuries. Many medieval laws were introduced during emergencies, curfews during plagues, travel restrictions during wars, trade monopolies during famines. And while the crisis ended, the laws often stayed, quietly becoming normal. Even clothing norms followed this pattern. Sumptuary laws were created to temporarily restrict luxury during economic strain, but they permanently shaped ideas of class, appropriate fashion, influencing how societies still associate certain clothing with status or respectability. Universities began as temporary guild-like associations of scholars seeking protection from local authorities, yet they evolved into permanent institutions that define modern education. Medieval church practices offer even more examples. Indulgences, originally framed as temporary spiritual aids, became institutionalized systems that altered religious economics. Monastic vows were intended as personal spiritual experiments, but monasteries became massive land-owning power structures. The medieval obsession with documentation, charters, seals, written contracts, was meant to reduce disputes in unstable times, but it laid the foundation for today's bureaucratic paperwork culture, where forms and signatures govern nearly every aspect of life. Even architectural choices endured beyond their necessity. Castles were built as temporary defensive solutions, yet their layouts influenced government buildings, prisons, and city planning long after siege warfare became obsolete. Many medieval punishments were meant as temporary deterrents during lawless periods, but public shaming, fines, and incarceration persisted, morphing into modern justice systems. Language itself carries medieval leftovers. Legal phrases, honorifics, and formal titles were created to reinforce feudal authority, yet they still echo in courtrooms, academia, and official communication. Guilds were originally short-term mutual protection networks for craftsmen facing unstable markets, but their structures became the ancestors of modern unions, professional licenses, and trade regulations. Even the concept of weekends has medieval roots in church-mandated rest days that were never meant to structure global labor patterns. Borders drawn as temporary compromises between medieval kingdoms hardened into national boundaries that still fuel political conflict today. Perhaps most striking is how fear-based systems lingered. Surveillance methods, moral policing, and social conformity rules introduced during times of religious panic or invasion threats quietly normalized oversight and control. Medical practices offer similar stories. Quarantine began as a desperate temporary response to plague, but it became a standard public health tool worldwide. Banking institutions emerged as temporary solutions for safely storing wealth during unstable times, yet they grew into permanent financial empires. Even the idea of centralized authority itself, strengthened in medieval Europe to maintain order after Rome's collapse, was never rolled back, only expanded. In essence, medieval society was full of just for now. Decisions made under pressure, fear, or convenience, and humanity rarely let go of solutions that worked, even when they quietly reshaped freedom, identity, and daily life. The medieval world may seem distant, but many of its temporary fixes are still living inside modern systems, silently reminding us that once an idea proves useful, history almost never fully lets it go. Beyond institutions and laws, medieval habits that were meant to fade often became embedded in psychology, culture, and routine. Timekeeping itself is one such example. Church bells originally rang to regulate prayer and communal duties during unstable periods, acting as a temporary coordination tool in largely illiterate societies. Yet this evolved into the strict scheduling culture that governs modern workdays, deadlines, and productivity metrics. The fixation on punctuality and hourly labor can be traced back to monastic discipline rather than natural human rhythms. Similarly, the medieval concept of respect for authority was reinforced temporarily to prevent rebellion during fragile political eras, but over time it solidified into deeply ingrained social conditioning, where questioning hierarchy is often seen as dangerous or inappropriate. Many social taboos also originated as emergency moral controls. Restrictions on sexuality, speech, and personal expression were enforced to maintain order during famine, plague, or religious turmoil. But these norms lingered long after their original justification disappeared. Even the modern obsession with productivity has medieval roots. Idleness was condemned by religious doctrine as spiritually dangerous during times when survival required collective labor. But this belief hardened into a moral judgment that still equates rest with laziness. Housing patterns followed the same trajectory. Medieval towns built cramped, inward-facing homes for protection against attack, never intending such density to define urban life permanently. Yet modern cities still struggle with overcrowding, born from these defensive designs. The idea of lifelong careers also traces back to medieval apprenticeships, which were supposed to be temporary training arrangements, but became rigid professional identities that discouraged experimentation and late life change. Social shame as a control mechanism, gossip, reputation destruction, public humiliation, was amplified in medieval villages to maintain order without strong policing. But it persists today through digital platforms and social surveillance, merely updated in form rather than function. Even marriage customs reflect this pattern. Alliances were originally temporary economic contracts to stabilize families and land ownership, yet they evolved into lifelong legal and emotional institutions, burdened with expectations they were never designed to carry. Food traditions, too, were shaped by scarcity. Preservation methods like salting, smoking, and fermenting were survival tactics, but they became cultural staples long after refrigeration made them unnecessary. Superstitions and rituals born from fear of the unknown lingered as cultural habits, even after scientific understanding emerged. Perhaps most subtly, medieval crisis thinking itself survived. The tendency to respond to uncertainty with control, regulation, and rigidity rather than flexibility is a legacy of societies constantly bracing for collapse. The medieval world trained humanity to cling tightly to anything that reduced chaos. And once chaos receded, those tools remained because familiarity felt safer than freedom. What makes these remnants powerful is not their age but their invisibility. Most people live inside systems, habits, and beliefs, born from medieval emergencies without realizing they were never meant to last. History did not simply move on, it layered itself, and the medieval period quietly became a foundation stone under modern life, proving that temporary solutions, once normalized, often outlive the problems they were meant to solve. Another layer of medieval temporary thinking that never truly vanished lies in how societies learned to manage fear, uncertainty, and belonging. Community identity in medieval villages was intensely enforced because survival depended on trust within small groups. Outsiders were treated with suspicion, not out of cruelty but necessity. This mindset was never meant to scale beyond local life, yet it hardened into long-lasting ideas of nationalism, xenophobia, and us versus them, thinking that still influence politics and social behavior today. Medieval oaths of loyalty were originally short-term assurances during unstable reigns, but they evolved into permanent expectations of allegiance to kings, states, companies, even brands. Where loyalty is often valued more than truth or adaptability, the medieval reliance on symbolism also endured. Coats of arms, banners, seals, and religious icons were meant to quickly identify allies and authority in chaotic environments. Yet modern society still depends heavily on logos, uniforms, flags, and credentials to signal trust and power, even when deeper evaluation would be more rational. Education itself carried forward medieval limitations. Early learning focused on memorization because books were scarce and fragile, but rote learning persisted long after printing made knowledge abundant, shaping modern schooling systems that still reward recall over understanding. Punitive attitudes toward debt are another inheritance. Debtors' prisons were emergency measures to enforce economic order, but the moral shame attached to debt survived, influencing how societies still judge financial failure harshly rather than structurally. Even silence became institutionalized. Medieval subjects were encouraged to keep quiet to avoid heresy accusations or political punishment. And this evolved into cultures where speaking out is subtly discouraged through social or professional consequences. Religious fasting practices, created as temporary spiritual discipline and resource management during scarcity, turned into long-term dietary norms and moral judgments about consumption. The medieval fixation on lineage and legitimacy, originally crucial to prevent violent succession disputes, left behind an obsession with credentials, degrees, and pedigree that still shapes hiring, marriage, and social status. Fear of disorder also left its mark on architecture and public spaces. Narrow streets, centralized squares, and watchtowers were built for surveillance and defense, and modern cities still reflect this logic through controlled movement, cameras, and zoning that prioritizes monitoring over comfort. Even emotional restraint traces back to medieval ideals of stoicism promoted to endure hardship. But this survival mechanism became a lasting cultural expectation that discourages vulnerability, especially among men. What ties all these remnants together is that medieval people were constantly preparing for collapse, famine, invasion, plague, divine punishment, and any system that reduced risk, even slightly, was preserved without question. When stability eventually increased, humanity rarely paused to ask whether those systems still served human well-being. Instead, they were inherited, normalized, and defended as tradition. The medieval world did not disappear. It simply became invisible, embedded in habits so familiar that they feel natural. And that is perhaps the most enduring medieval legacy of all, the human tendency to mistake long survival for permanent wisdom, and to carry yesterday's emergency tools into today's entirely different world. Yet another forgotten layer of medieval leftovers exists in how people relate to power, morality, and self-worth. Medieval rulers promoted the idea that suffering was meaningful, that endurance itself was a virtue, because it helped populations tolerate poverty, heavy labor, and inequality during fragile times. This belief was never meant to justify long-term imbalance, but it evolved into modern narratives that glorify struggle, romanticize burnout, and frame systemic failure as personal character building. Similarly, the medieval concept of divine order taught people that their position in life was preassigned, a temporary psychological stabilizer to prevent rebellion when mobility was impossible. Yet echoes of this remain in modern fatalism, where people are told to accept reality rather than challenge unjust systems. Shame-based morality expanded because medieval communities lacked complex enforcement tools. Guilt, confession, and public repentance were used to self-regulate behavior. But this internalized moral surveillance persists today, shaping anxiety, perfectionism, and fear of judgment, even in secular societies. Medieval hospitality rules, originally survival agreements ensuring travelers weren't killed or robbed, hardened into rigid social etiquette that often prioritizes politeness over honesty. Even romantic ideals were shaped by medieval constraints. Courtly love emerged, partly because marriages were transactional, never intended to define real relationships. Yet modern expectations of romance still chase idealized, unrealistic emotional narratives born from that imbalance. The medieval habit of recording sins, debts, and obligations created a culture of moral accounting that never went away. People still measure their worth through productivity, achievements, and social approval, as if existence itself requires justification. Entertainment followed the same path. Festivals, executions, and public spectacles were temporary pressure valves for stressed populations. But spectacle culture survived, evolving into mass media, outrage cycles, and constant stimulation as a way to manage collective anxiety. Even humor carried medieval scars, satire, and mockery were permitted only as controlled outlets, shaping traditions where laughter often targets weakness rather than power. The obsession with legacy also traces back to a time when death was omnipresent. Medieval people sought permanence through monuments, names, and lineage. But modern society inherited this anxiety, transforming it into obsession with fame, documentation, and digital immortality. Perhaps most quietly, medieval fear of chaos embedded a belief that complexity must always be simplified into rules, categories, and binaries, even when reality is fluid. That mindset survives in modern debates, identities, and ideologies that prefer certainty over nuance. In the end, medieval society did not just pass down structures, it passed down reflexes, how humans react under pressure, how they cope with uncertainty, and how temporary survival strategies harden into how things are. What makes these remnants powerful is that they feel ancient, natural, and unquestionable, even though they were born from moments of fear, scarcity, and instability that no longer define the world. The medieval age ended on paper, but psychologically, culturally, and institutionally, it never truly left. Even deeper beneath daily behavior, medieval survival logic quietly shaped how people understand safety, success, and meaning. The medieval fixation on accumulation of land, grain, gold, favors, or spiritual merit was originally a buffer against sudden catastrophe, but it evolved into modern hoarding instincts, wealth obsession, and the idea that security comes only from constant acquisition. Scarcity thinking never fully left. Many people still behave as though disaster is always one step away, even in times of abundance, leading to chronic anxiety and over-competition. Medieval concepts of purity and contamination created to explain disease and misfortune before germ theory existed, hardened into lasting fears around bodies, identity, and difference, influencing everything from hygiene norms to social exclusion. Even the way people apologize carries medieval residue. Confession was formalized to maintain order and reintegrate individuals into the community. But it evolved into performative guilt rituals where expression matters more than repair. The medieval habit of seeking authority, approved truth, because independent thinking could be dangerous, never disappeared, resurfacing today in blind trust of institutions, experts, or dominant narratives, even when evidence is accessible. Leisure itself became suspect. Medieval authorities feared too much free time would breed rebellion, so structured labor and moral oversight were encouraged, a belief that echoes today when rest must be earned, and relaxation is framed as indulgence rather than necessity. Childhood was barely recognized in medieval life due to high mortality, leading to early responsibility and emotional restraint. Modern societies inherited traces of this through pressure to mature quickly, measure worth early, and fear falling behind invisible timelines. Even the modern fixation on records, grades, credit scores, criminal histories, digital footprints, descends from medieval lists of tithes, sins, and obligations that were never meant to define a person's entire future, yet now follow individuals for life. Crisis storytelling also survived. Medieval sermons framed events as moral lessons to maintain order during uncertainty. And modern media continues this pattern by turning disasters into narratives of blame, heroism, or punishment rather than complex systemic failures. The medieval tendency to personalize misfortune, assuming suffering must have a reason, still shapes how people judge themselves and others when things go wrong. Perhaps most haunting is how medieval people learned to normalize instability. When danger is constant, resilience becomes identity. That identity was passed down, generation by generation, until struggling itself became familiar, even comfortable. Many people today unconsciously distrust ease, interpreting calm periods as suspicious or temporary. What began as medieval endurance hardened into a worldview where peace feels undeserved, and still, the medieval imprint reaches into how people imagine the future and interpret hope. Medieval societies rarely planned far ahead because survival was uncertain. Instead, they focused on short-term continuity, getting through the next season, the next ruler, the next threat. This mindset quietly survived, shaping modern short-term thinking, where systems prioritize immediate gain over long-term well-being, whether in economics, environmental choices, or personal life decisions. Even the fear of wasted potential traces back to medieval anxieties about divine judgment, where every action had moral weight. Today, People feel pressured to optimize every moment, fearing that rest or indecision is a kind of failure. The medieval habit of measuring worth through visible contribution, work, obedience, sacrifice, never fully faded, making invisible labor like emotional care, reflection, or healing feel less legitimate. Trust itself was shaped by medieval fragility. Betrayal could mean death, so loyalty was prized over adaptability, a reflex that still causes people to stay in harmful jobs, systems, or relationships simply because leaving feels like moral failure. Even storytelling structures reflect medieval inheritance. Tales emphasized punishment, redemption, and reward to reinforce order, and modern narratives still struggle to escape these moral binaries. The medieval need for certainty in an unpredictable world produced rigid belief systems, and while science replaced theology, the craving for absolute answers remained, now attaching itself to ideologies, productivity systems, or self-help formulas that promise control. The idea that life must follow a correct sequence, education, work, marriage, legacy, echoes medieval life scripts designed to reduce chaos. But today they create quiet panic for anyone who deviates. Medieval silence around mental suffering, born from lack of understanding and fear of stigma, still echoes in how people minimize emotional pain or treat it as personal weakness. Even modern optimism carries medieval scars. Hope was often framed as endurance rather than joy, teaching generations that happiness is something postponed rather than lived. What makes all this remarkable is not that medieval people were wrong, but that their temporary survival strategies were so effective they became invisible defaults. The world changed faster than the instincts guiding it, and humanity kept using old tools for new problems. In this way, the medieval age never truly ended. It settled into habits, expectations, and reflexes that quietly shape modern life from the inside. Temporary measures hardened into tradition, tradition into identity, and identity into common sense. And until those inherited instincts are questioned, the medieval past continues not as history, but as an unspoken operating system running beneath the modern world. Even the way people imagine freedom today carries medieval residue. In medieval life, freedom was not an abstract right, but a conditional privilege granted by authority, by a lord, a guild, a church, meant to keep society functional rather than empower individuals. That temporary framing never fully disappeared, which is why modern freedom is often still negotiated, licensed, monitored, or revoked, rather than assumed. The medieval dependence on permission-shaped cultures where people wait to be allowed to live differently instead of believing they inherently can. Risk aversion is another inheritance. Medieval people avoided deviation because mistakes could mean exile, starvation, or death, and that survival instinct hardened into modern fear of failure, where experimentation feels dangerous even when consequences are mild. Even ambition carries medieval echoes. Aspiration was discouraged unless sanctioned, so today many people unconsciously cap their dreams to what feels socially acceptable. The medieval reliance on rituals to manage uncertainty also persisted. Routines, habits, and traditions provide psychological safety, but when inherited uncritically, they become cages disguised as comfort. Modern bureaucracy mirrors medieval gatekeeping almost perfectly. Layers of approval, slow processes, and symbolic authority were once temporary controls to prevent chaos. yet they now dominate institutions long after their necessity has faded. Even compassion was regulated. Medieval charity was conditional and moralized to prevent dependency, a logic that still shapes how societies judge who deserves help. The medieval view of nature as hostile and needing domination, born from unpredictable climates and crop failure, survived into modern exploitation of resources, where control is prioritized over balance. Perhaps most quietly, medieval people learned to narrate their lives as tests rather than experiences, framing existence as something to endure until reward arrives later. That belief still whispers beneath modern life, teaching people to postpone joy, tolerate dissatisfaction, and normalize exhaustion. What unites all these threads is not cruelty or ignorance, but adaptation under pressure. Medieval societies did what they had to do to survive, and survival tools are rarely designed for happiness, creativity, or freedom. When those tools outlive the danger, they don't announce themselves as outdated. They become tradition, morality, realism. The medieval age, then, is not just a period in textbooks, but a long echo, repeating through systems, habits, and inner voices that tell people how much they are allowed to want, rest, risk, or hope. Until those echoes are recognized for what they are, temporary answers to long-gone threats, the past continues to quietly govern the present, not with swords or crowns, but with inherited assumptions that feel so normal they are rarely questioned at all. And even the way people define identity today carries the quiet fingerprints of medieval survival culture. In medieval societies, identity had to be stable and legible. Your role, faith, gender expectations, and social position needed to be clearly visible so communities could predict behavior in dangerous environments. Ambiguity was threatening. That temporary need for clarity hardened into long-lasting discomfort with fluid identities, complexity, and change. People still feel pressure to label themselves quickly and permanently, as if uncertainty itself were a risk. The medieval instinct to bind identity to duty, son of, servant of, believer of, never fully dissolved, which is why modern life often ties self-worth to job titles, relationship status, or social productivity, rather than inner experience. Even forgiveness carries medieval residue. Pardon was conditional and transactional, designed to restore order rather than heal. And today, many apologies and reconciliations still prioritize appearance over genuine repair. The medieval habit of equating visibility with legitimacy also survived. What could be seen, recorded, or witnessed was treated as real, while internal states were ignored, shaping modern cultures that value proof, performance, and metrics over lived experience. Silence, endurance, and compliance were once survival skills, but they quietly became moral virtues, teaching generations that tolerating discomfort is noble even when change is possible. The medieval fear of instability also trained people to mistrust sudden improvement. Good fortune was seen as temporary or suspicious, a belief that still makes people brace for loss, even in moments of success. Even humor evolved under constraint. Laughter had to be coded indirect or cruel to avoid punishment. And modern irony, sarcasm, and self-deprecation still carry that defensive edge. The medieval habit of externalizing control, believing fate, God, rulers, or systems ultimately decide outcomes, helped people cope with powerlessness. But it persists today as learned helplessness, where individuals underestimate their ability to influence their lives. Even progress itself is often framed in medieval terms: linear, hierarchical, permission-based rather than exploratory or cyclical. What is most striking is how many of these patterns are defended as human nature, when they are actually historical adaptations to conditions that no longer exist. Medieval people lived close to death, scarcity, and punishment, and they built mental and social armor to survive. That armor was passed down, polished, and normalized, even as the world slowly became safer, more abundant, and more complex. The tragedy is not that medieval solutions existed, but that they were never consciously retired. They linger as instincts, habits, and quiet rules that shape how people love, work, rest, hope, and fear. In this way, the medieval world never truly ended. It dissolved into the background of modern life, guiding behavior not through force, but through familiarity. And until those inherited reflexes are examined, questioned, and gently unlearned, the past continues to whisper instructions into the present long after the dangers that created them have faded away. Even the way people relate to truth and doubt carries medieval echoes. In a world where misinformation could get someone killed or condemned, certainty was safer than curiosity. So medieval cultures trained people to cling to fixed truths rather than live with ambiguity. That temporary survival reflex still shapes modern discomfort with nuance, where changing one's mind is seen as weakness, and certainty is mistaken for intelligence. The medieval habit of moral ranking, sorting people into good, sinful, loyal, dangerous, was meant to simplify judgment in crowded, fragile communities, but it evolved into modern polarization, where complex human beings are flattened into labels. Even conflict resolution reflects this inheritance. Medieval justice prioritized order over understanding, leading to winner-fay-loser outcomes rather than repair, a pattern still visible in courts, online arguments, and public discourse. At the deepest level, medieval inheritance lives in how people relate to their own inner lives. Medieval survival required emotional containment. Fear, grief, and doubt had to be suppressed because dwelling on them could paralyze action. In a world where hesitation was costly, that temporary emotional armor never fully dissolved, which is why many modern cultures still reward emotional control over emotional honesty. People learn early to manage appearances, to keep pain functional rather than healed, to treat feelings as inconveniences rather than information. The medieval separation between the public self and the inner self was necessary to avoid punishment or exclusion, but today it manifests as chronic disconnection, where people perform competence while privately feeling lost. Even the instinct to seek permission for happiness traces back to a time when joy could attract suspicion or envy in tightly bound communities. Celebration was cautious, modest, and brief. This hesitation lingers, making people delay fulfillment until conditions feel safe enough, a moment that rarely arrives. The medieval belief that suffering purifies the soul quietly survived into modern ideas that pain is required for growth, success, or worth, causing people to endure situations that no longer teach, only drain. Even imagination was once regulated. Fantasy, speculation, and alternative visions could be dangerous in rigid belief systems. So creativity learned to disguise itself. And today many people still struggle to imagine lives radically different from the ones they were shown. The medieval world trained humanity to compress itself to fit narrow paths, and those paths were passed down as realism, maturity, responsibility. What began as adaptation hardened into identity. And so, long after the walls fell and the threats receded, people still carry medieval instincts into modern lives, instincts to endure instead of question, to obey instead of explore, to survive instead of fully live. The most enduring medieval structure is not a castle or a law, but an inherited posture toward existence itself, cautious, restrained, and braced for loss. Until that posture is consciously examined, the medieval age continues, not as history, but as habit quietly shaping how people think, choose, love, and imagine what is possible. And perhaps the final, most persistent medieval inheritance is the way people learn to normalize dissatisfaction. Medieval life trained people to expect discomfort as the baseline. Warmth, safety, abundance, and peace were temporary exceptions, rather than the norm. That expectation quietly survived, shaping modern lives where chronic stress, low-grade unhappiness, and emotional exhaustion are treated as ordinary, rather than alarming. People often feel guilty for wanting ease, clarity, or joy, as though comfort must be justified by effort or sacrifice. The medieval habit of enduring rather than redesigning life taught generations to adapt themselves to systems instead of reshaping systems to fit human needs. Even modern resilience narratives echo this. Past strength is praised not for creating better conditions, but for surviving bad ones repeatedly. The medieval belief that order matters more than happiness still whispers beneath institutions that value stability over well-being and tradition over transformation. People learn to tolerate misalignment, to shrink desires, to wait patiently for later, because waiting once meant survival. Over time, this posture becomes identity, responsible, realistic, mature. Yet beneath it lies an unexamined grief for lives half-lived and possibilities never explored. What makes this inheritance so powerful is that it does not announce itself as oppression. It feels like wisdom, discipline, adulthood. But wisdom born from scarcity does not automatically serve abundance. The medieval world taught humanity how to survive collapse, not how to flourish in stability. And until that distinction is consciously recognized, many people will continue to live cautiously in a world that no longer demands it, carrying ancient survival instincts into rooms filled with opportunity. The medieval age, in the end, did not fail to disappear. It succeeded too well at teaching lessons that were never meant to be permanent. Even after all of this, the medieval echo persists in the quiet assumption that life is fundamentally something to be managed rather than experienced. Medieval existence demanded constant vigilance, watching harvests, weather, rulers, neighbours, and signs of danger, and this vigilance hardened into a background mental tension that never fully relaxed. Modern people often feel restless even in safety, checking notifications, monitoring progress, anticipating problems that have not yet arrived. Calm can feel unnatural, even uncomfortable, because centuries of survival trained the nervous system to stay alert. The medieval habit of preparing for loss also lingers. People are taught to temper happiness, to not get too excited, to keep expectations low so disappointment hurts less. What began as emotional self-defense quietly became a cultural norm that limits joy before it can fully bloom. Even gratitude carries medieval traces. Thankfulness was framed as obligation toward authority or fate, not as free appreciation. So today, gratitude is sometimes practiced as duty rather than genuine presence. The medieval fear of standing out, once a matter of physical safety, now appears as fear of visibility, fear of success, fear of being truly seen. Many people unconsciously sabotage moments of growth because expansion feels risky, unfamiliar, and exposed. The medieval training to endure silently also shaped how people treat pain in others. Suffering is often acknowledged, but quickly normalized, minimized, or redirected toward endurance rather than change. Compassion becomes conditional when hardship is assumed to be inevitable. Even dreams are often downsized before they are spoken, edited to sound reasonable, echoing a time when imagining too much could invite danger or disappointment. The medieval legacy is not loud or obvious. It is subtle, woven into instincts that feel personal but are profoundly historical. It lives in hesitation before joy, in loyalty to systems that no longer serve, in the quiet belief that life should be harder than it needs to be. The past, in this sense, is not behind humanity but inside it, carried forward not through memory but through habit. And until ease, curiosity, rest and fulfillment are trusted as legitimate states rather than suspicious luxuries, the medieval age continues its longest reign, not over kingdoms, but over expectations of what a human life is allowed to feel like. At the very edge of this long inheritance lies a final medieval reflex, the quiet belief that life's meaning must be earned rather than simply lived. In medieval worlds shaped by scarcity and judgment, existence alone was not considered sufficient. Value had to be proven through obedience, labor, sacrifice, faith, or suffering. That belief settled deep into collective consciousness and still shapes how people measure themselves today. Many feel they must justify rest, explain happiness, defend ease, or prove they deserve good things. Joy without struggle can feel suspicious, even undeserved. This reflex teaches people to postpone aliveness until milestones are met, permissions are granted, or validation is secured, echoing a time when safety truly depended on external approval. Even modern ideas of self-worth are often conditional, tied to output, resilience, or usefulness, rather than inherent dignity. The medieval fear of chaos also taught people to distrust inner guidance. Intuition was unreliable in a world ruled by superstition and authority, so people learned to look outward for instruction. That habit survived, leaving many disconnected from their own needs, instincts, and rhythms. Even silence today can feel uncomfortable, because medieval silence meant waiting for danger or judgment. Noise, busyness, and constant engagement become ways to avoid facing that inherited stillness. What is most striking is how rarely these patterns are recognized as historical. They are often explained as realism, discipline, ambition, or maturity, when in truth they are echoes of lives lived under constant threat. The medieval world trained humanity to survive long winters, brutal hierarchies, and fragile stability. It succeeded. But survival training, when mistaken for life wisdom, becomes a quiet cage. The world changed, but many inner rules did not, and so people continue to live carefully in conditions that no longer require caution, carrying old armor into open fields. The medieval age did not end with a date or a revolution. It faded into habits, expectations, and self-talk. And perhaps the most radical act of the modern age is not innovation or rebellion, but the gentle unlearning of the idea that life must be endured to be valid, allowing existence to be something more than survival, something closer to presence, curiosity, and quiet, unearned joy. And beyond even that, the medieval echo survives in the way people relate to endings and beginnings. Medieval life was so precarious that closure was rare. Wars paused, plagues receded, rulers changed, but uncertainty never truly resolved. As a result, people learned to live without clear endings, carrying unresolved grief, unfinished stories, and unspoken losses forward, simply because stopping to process them was not safe. That habit persists today in how people move on quickly, bury emotions, and treat closure as a luxury rather than a necessity. Grief is often rushed, transitions minimized, and reflection postponed indefinitely, as if pausing might cause everything to collapse. Even modern impatience has medieval roots. When tomorrow was never guaranteed, urgency became normal, and that urgency hardened into a constant pressure to move fast and pressure. There is also a lingering medieval imprint in how people interpret silence from others. In medieval life, silence could signal danger, withdrawal of protection, brewing conflict, impending punishment. As a result, people learn to read absence as threat. That reflex survives today when unanswered messages, delayed replies, or emotional quiet trigger anxiety far out of proportion to the situation. People fill gaps with worst case stories, not because they are insecure by nature, but because history trained humans to assume that silence precedes harm. This is why reassurance is so sought after, why ambiguity in relationships feels intolerable, and why many over-communicate not from neediness, but from inherited vigilance. Even reassurance itself can become addictive because medieval life rarely offered stable emotional safety. Another quiet inheritance lies in how people relate to rest after achievement. In medieval times, completing a task rarely brought lasting relief. There was always another danger, another season, another obligation waiting. Rest was brief and conditional. That pattern persists today when people struggle to stop after finishing something meaningful. Achievements are quickly followed by new goals, new pressures, new standards. Satisfaction feels fleeting, almost suspicious. Many move immediately to what's next, not because they are ungrateful, but because the nervous system never learned how to settle. Medieval life did not reward lingering in completion. Survival required constant forward motion. That forward lean still shapes modern ambition. There is also a medieval residue in how people treat mistakes made in public. Public error once carried severe consequences, shame, punishment, exclusion, so invisibility became protection. That fear lives on in how people curate themselves, avoid vulnerability, and fear being seen while learning. Even growth is often hidden until it is polished. People hesitate to begin publicly because they fear being judged mid-process. This is not vanity, it is historical memory. The medieval world punished unfinishedness. The modern world often claims to celebrate authenticity, but inherited fear still whispers that being seen imperfectly is unsafe. The medieval age also shaped how people experience generosity. Generosity once had strings, patronage, obligation, loyalty. Gifts were rarely free. That conditioning lingers today when people struggle to receive without guilt or suspicion. Kindness can feel uncomfortable, triggering the urge to repay, explain, or minimize. Many are far better at giving than receiving, because receiving once created debt. Even love can feel transactional when viewed through this inherited lens, measured in effort rather than presence. Another subtle echo lives in how people experience time off. Medieval rest was often enforced. Holy days, seasonal pauses, rather than chosen. That enforcement taught people to rest only when permitted. Today, even when time off is available, many struggle to truly take it. They feel restless, unproductive, or uneasy, checking work, planning ahead, staying mentally on. Freedom to rest exists, but permission feels missing. The medieval world taught humanity how to stop only when told to stop. Even the way people narrate their lives carries medieval structure. Stories were once moral lessons, warnings, examples, proofs of virtue or failure. That framing persists today when people feel pressure to turn their experiences into lessons, growth arcs, or justifications. Suffering must mean something. Pain must be redeemed. Few feel allowed to say, "This hurt," and that's all. The medieval need to extract meaning from hardship helped people endure chaos. But it also taught them to distrust experiences that do not resolve neatly. Perhaps one of the most persistent residues is the belief that inner peace is fragile and must be protected through control. Medieval life required constant regulation of behavior, belief, emotion, because instability was everywhere. That regulation moved inward. Many people now manage themselves relentlessly, monitoring moods, optimizing habits, fixing thoughts, correcting reactions. Self-regulation becomes self-surveillance. Peace is treated as something to maintain through effort, rather than something that can arise naturally when pressure eases. And beneath all of this is a medieval inheritance that rarely gets named, grief for a world that never felt safe. That grief was never processed because there was no time, no space, no language for it. It passed forward, diluted but persistent, settling into the background of human experience as melancholy, restlessness, or quiet dissatisfaction. Many people feel sadness without a clear cause, because the cause is not personal, it is historical. It is the residue of generations who survived but never exhaled. The medieval age, in this light, is not only about caution and endurance, but about unresolved mourning. Mourning for ease that never existed, for softness that could not be afforded, for lives lived under constant threat. That mourning was postponed, and postponement became habit. Modern life inherited the habit without the context. To give more, then, is not to add new layers, but to recognize how deep the inheritance already goes. It touches attention, emotion, relationships, ambition, rest, desire, and self-trust. It is not a flaw to carry it. It is evidence that humanity survived conditions that demanded extraordinary restraint. But survival is not the final chapter. The quiet work now is learning to do something humans have had very little practice with across history, letting safety actually feel safe. Letting calm be calm, letting good moments stand without bracing, letting life be lived forward, rather than managed against imagined collapse. When that begins to happen, even briefly, people often feel disoriented, emotional, or unexpectedly tired. That is not weakness. It is the body, mind, and heart finally stepping out of a posture held for centuries. The medieval age does not leave all at once. It loosens in moments, in breaths, in small permissions, in the growing realization that many inner rules were written for a world that no longer exists, and that it is not betrayal of the past to live differently now. And even after all of that, there remains one of the most deeply rooted medieval inheritances of all, the habit of mistrusting ease in oneself while accepting it in others. Medieval communities survived by strict self-regulation. Indulgence in oneself was dangerous, but leniency toward others maintained social cohesion. The asymmetry survived. Many people today are far more forgiving of others' rest, confusion, or slowness than their own. They allow others to pause, yet pressure themselves to continue. They grant others complexity, yet demand coherence from themselves. This is not self-hatred. It is an inherited rule that says that I must hold myself together, no matter what. Medieval survival depended on individuals policing themselves, so the group could endure. That inner policing never truly retired. There is also a medieval echo in how people treat intuition. In a world ruled by doctrine and authority, trusting one's inner voice was risky. Intuition could contradict church, lord, or law. Over time, people learn to doubt inner knowing and privilege external validation. That habit persists today when people second-guess themselves endlessly, seeking confirmation before trusting their own perceptions. Even when something feels wrong or right at a deep level, many hesitate to act until it is socially sanctioned. The medieval world taught humanity to outsource trust. Modern life inherited that outsourcing, even when inner guidance is no longer dangerous. Another residue lives in the way people experience transitions. Medieval transitions, puberty, marriage, loss, role changes, were abrupt, ritualized, and rarely supported emotionally. You adapted, or you didn't. That lack of gentleness around change survived. Today, many people feel unsteady during transitions but judge themselves for it, believing adjustment should be quick and quiet. They rush themselves through grief, identity shifts, and life changes because slowness once threatened survival. The medieval world did not allow spacious transitions. Modern people often don't allow them either, even when time exists. Even humour carries inheritance. Medieval humour often relied on cruelty, inversion, or mockery, safe ways to release tension without challenging power. That legacy persists in sarcasm, self-deprecation, and humour that cuts rather than heals. Many people learn to make themselves smaller through jokes, deflecting attention away from vulnerability or pride. Laughter becomes armour. The medieval world allowed humour, but only when it maintained order. That constraint still shapes how people use wit to survive rather than to express joy. There is also a medieval shadow in how people treat success in others. In fragile societies, another's rise could threaten one's own survival. Envy was dangerous, but so was visibility. That tension lingers today in subtle discomfort around others' success, not always as jealousy, but as unease, comparison, or quiet withdrawal. Celebration feels complicated because visibility once carried risk. Even admiration can be tangled with fear because success was never neutral in hierarchical worlds. Many people unconsciously downplay their achievements, not from humility, but from an inherited instinct to stay safe. Perhaps one of the most hidden inheritances is the belief that emotional clarity must come severe after hardship, not during calm. Medieval insight often emerged through suffering, illness, loss, spiritual crisis, because those were the moments when life slowed enough to reflect. That pattern survived as the belief that understanding only comes after breaking down. People wait for crisis to change, for pain to justify reflection. And beyond that space, there is still one more medieval inheritance quietly shaping modern lives. The belief that safety comes from sameness. Medieval communities survived by minimizing unpredictability. Sameness in belief, behavior, dress, and routine reduced risk. Difference was not just unfamiliar, it was dangerous. That instinct survived the centuries and still whispers today. When people feel uneasy around unfamiliar paths, unconventional lives, or ways of thinking that don't mirror their own, even when diversity poses no threat, the nervous system can react as if it does. This is why people often seek validation before choosing differently, why originality feels risky, and why blending in can feel safer than standing out. The medieval world taught humanity that safety lived in the center of the herd, and that lesson settled deep. There is also a lingering medieval relationship with patience that is often misunderstood. Patience once meant survival, waiting through winters, sieges, plagues, and rule changes. Endurance was not optional. Over time, that survival patience was moralized into virtue, even when waiting no longer serves growth. Today, many people wait far too long, waiting to speak, to leave, to begin, to claim space. Believing restraint is wisdom, but this patience is often not choice, it is inheritance. The medieval world taught people how to wait for danger to pass, not how to recognize when waiting itself becomes the danger. Even the way people imagine a good life carries medieval fingerprints. A good life was once defined by stability, respectability, and survival, food, shelter, acceptance, protection. Joy, curiosity, and fulfillment were luxuries. That definition still quietly guides modern aspirations. Many people chase security long after it is achieved, unsure what to reach for next. They feel restless without knowing why, because the goalposts were set in a time when mere survival was the victory. When stability is achieved, there is often no inherited map for what comes after. The medieval world taught how to endure life, not how to inhabit it fully. There is also a medieval echo in how people respond to ease with suspicion. Ease once preceded danger. Periods of calm often ended abruptly. That pattern trained people to distrust smoothness, to assume something bad is coming when things feel too good. Even now, many people subconsciously prepare for loss during moments of peace. They stay slightly tense, slightly guarded, as if relaxation itself were irresponsible. This is not pessimism. It is memory without context. Perhaps most quietly, the medieval age shaped how people relate to their own desires. Desire was dangerous. Wanting too much could invite disappointment, envy, punishment, or loss. So desire learned to whisper rather than speak. That restraint persists today in how people minimize what they want, negotiate with their dreams, and ask for less than they feel. Wanting boldly can feel reckless, immature, or selfish, even when nothing is at stake. The medieval world taught humanity to want carefully. What becomes clear, after tracing all these layers, is that the medieval age did not merely leave behind institutions or traditions. It left behind an emotional operating system, one built for scarcity, threat, hierarchy, and endurance. That system worked. It carried humanity through centuries of instability, but it was never meant to run a world of relative safety, choice, and possibility. And so the quiet tension of modern life is not just about technology, economics, or speed. It is about living with ancient reflexes in a world that no longer requires them. People feel tired, not only because they do too much, but because they are constantly bracing for dangers that rarely arrive. They hesitate, not because they lack courage, but because courage once carried lethal consequences. They delay joy, not because they don't want it, but because joy once had to be rationed. The medieval age lingers not as a memory, but as a posture, one of caution, endurance, and self-restraint. And the slow, unfamiliar task of the present is not to reject that posture, but to recognize when it is no longer needed, to notice when the armor is heavier than the threat, to realize that many inner rules were written for winters that ended long ago. When that recognition takes root, something subtle shifts. Life stops feeling like a test that must be passed and starts feeling like a place that can be entered. Not conquered, not endured, simply entered. And in that quiet shift, the medieval age finally, gently begins to loosen its hold. And even after that loosening begins, there is one more medieval habit that tends to surface last. Precisely because it feels so normal, the instinct to treat peace as fragile. Medieval peace was always provisional, a pause between conflicts rather than a stable condition. Treaties broke, rulers died, alliances shifted overnight. Peace was enjoyed quietly, cautiously, never trusted to last. That assumption settled deep, and it still shapes how people live inside calm moments today. When life finally becomes steady, many feel oddly restless or uneasy, scanning for disruption, inventing problems, or overloading themselves with new pressures. Stability can feel empty because the nervous system learned to equate motion with safety. The medieval world trained people to stay alert even when nothing was happening, and that vigilance survived long after the need for it faded. This is why many modern lives are filled not just with activity, but with unnecessary strain. People create urgency where none exists, over-prepare for unlikely threats, and keep themselves perpetually busy as a way to feel secure. Busyness becomes armor. exhaustion becomes proof of worth. Stillness becomes suspicious. These are not personal flaws. They are inherited responses to a world that once punished relaxation. Even success can trigger anxiety, because medieval success attracted attention, envy, and danger. To rise too visibly was to invite challenge. That reflex lingers when people downplay achievements, sabotage momentum, or feel uncomfortable being fully seen. Safety once lived in modesty and invisibility, and that lesson still whispers beneath modern ambition. There is also a medieval echo in how people relate to endings that go well. Clean endings were rare, loss was abrupt, unresolved, and often violent. As a result, people learn to expect pain at the end of things. That expectation persists today when people anticipate heartbreak before it arrives, assume that good things must end badly, or cling to situations past their natural conclusion out of fear of loss. Even happiness is sometimes lived with a countdown mentality, enjoyed with one eye on its eventual disappearance. This is not cynicism. It is inheritance from a time when impermanence was brutal and undeniable. Another subtle residue lives in how people interpret responsibility. Medieval survival required constant vigilance and personal responsibility. Mistakes had immediate consequences. That burden became internalized, and today many people carry a level of self-blame that far exceeds their actual control. They feel responsible for outcomes shaped by systems, chance, or other people. This creates chronic guilt and over-functioning, where individuals try to manage everything to prevent collapse that is no longer imminent. The medieval world trained humanity to believe that if something goes wrong, someone must be at fault, often oneself. That reflex still drives anxiety, self-criticism, and the inability to rest without feeling negligent. Even modern ideals of strength are shaped by this past. Strength is still often defined as endurance, silence, self-denial, and emotional containment, qualities that once kept people alive. But in a safer world, those same qualities can quietly erode intimacy, creativity, and joy. Many people are strong in ways that no longer serve them, mistaking survival skills for life skills. They know how to endure discomfort, but not how to receive ease. They know how to push through pain, but not how to stop before damage occurs. The medieval world taught humanity how to suffer. Well, it did not teach how to rest deeply. Perhaps the most revealing sign of this inheritance is how foreign gentleness can feel. Gentleness was a luxury in medieval life. Harshness was practical. That imbalance left a mark. Many people are far harsher with themselves than with others, policing thoughts, emotions, and desires with rules that no longer have a purpose. Self-compassion can feel indulgent, even irresponsible, because it contradicts centuries of conditioning that equated strictness with safety. Yet the danger those rules once guarded against has largely passed. What emerges, again and again, is the same quiet truth. The medieval age taught humanity how to survive instability, not how to trust stability when it arrives. And so modern life is often lived with one foot still braced against a door that is no longer under attack. The body relaxes slowly, the mind relaxes slower. The habits relax last. The work of truly leaving the medieval age, then, is not about rejecting history or pretending danger never existed. It is about recognizing when inherited vigilance has become unnecessary weight, about learning that peace does not need to be earned through exhaustion, that joy does not need to be rationed, that ease is not a trap. It is about allowing calm to be calm, success to be safe, and life to unfold without constant management. That transition is quiet, internal, and often unsettling, because it asks people to loosen skills that once defined them. But it also offers something rare in human history: the chance to live without armor by default. Not because danger is impossible, but because it is no longer constant, and in that space, when vigilance finally softens into awareness, and endurance gives way to presence. There is also a medieval shadow in how people relate to belonging. In medieval life, belonging was not emotional, it was existential. Being cast out meant exposure, hunger, and death. That reality carved belonging deep into the nervous system as a non-negotiable need. Even now, long after exile no longer equals death, people still fear social rejection with an intensity that feels disproportionate to the actual risk. They silence themselves, reshape their values, and suppress instincts to maintain connection, often without realizing that this reflex was once about survival, not preference. The medieval habit of equating belonging with obedience quietly survived, teaching people that acceptance must be earned by fitting in. Even authenticity can feel dangerous, because difference once invited punishment. Alongside this lives a medieval relationship with loyalty. Loyalty was survival currency. Switching sides could be fatal. That reflex persists today in how people stay in harmful jobs, institutions, or relationships, far beyond reason, mistaking loyalty for virtue. Leaving can feel like betrayal even when staying causes harm. Another inheritance lies in how people interpret authority figures. Medieval authority was absolute and often arbitrary, so appeasement became a strategy. That appeasement survives as people-pleasing, conflict avoidance, and fear of displeasing those perceived as powerful, even when power is symbolic or temporary. Many adults still feel like children around bosses, systems, or institutions because their nervous system remembers authority as dangerous. The medieval world also shaped how people relate to the body. Bodies were fragile, exposed to disease and injury, so control and restraint were emphasized. That caution lingers today in discomfort with physical pleasure, rest, or intuition. The body is often treated as something to discipline rather than listen to. Even illness is moralized, echoing medieval ideas of impurity or failure. There is also a medieval imprint in how people treat endings. Letting go once meant vulnerability, so clinging became safety. That clinging persists in grief that is postponed, relationships that linger without life, and identities that remain long after they have expired. People often stay attached not because something is right, but because release still feels like danger. Perhaps most subtly, the medieval age trained people to mistake familiarity for safety. What is known feels safer than what is new, even when the known is harmful. That reflex still governs many choices, keeping people in cycles that feel tolerable rather than expansive. The medieval world taught humanity how to survive inside narrow corridors. Those corridors became home, and now when the walls are gone, many people still walk as if they are there, careful not to step too far to either side. The echo of the medieval age is not just caution, it is contraction, and recognizing that contraction for what it is, rather than who we are, may be the first step toward living in a world that no longer requires such smallness. And beneath even that contraction lies another medieval inheritance, the instinct to equate familiarity with truth. In medieval societies, what was familiar, beliefs, customs, hierarchies, kept people alive. Novelty carried real risk, so repetition became proof. Over generations, this survival shortcut hardened into the assumption that what has always been done must be right. That reflex still shapes modern resistance to change, where new ideas are dismissed, not because they fail, but because they feel strange. People often trust what feels known over what is kind, accurate, or liberating. Even harmful patterns can feel true, simply because they are familiar. The medieval world also trained people to compress their emotional range. Extremes were dangerous. Too much joy attracted envy. Too much grief weakened resolve. Moderation became protection. That emotional narrowing survives today in muted lives, where people avoid feeling too deeply in either direction, mistaking numbness for balance. Even celebration is often restrained, edited, or postponed, as if emotional expansion itself were risky. There is also a lingering medieval reflex to externalize blame upward or downward, rather than look laterally or systemically. In hierarchical worlds, responsibility flowed vertically, God, King, Lord, Sinner, because complexity was unmanageable. That structure persists today in how people search for villains or saviors, instead of addressing systems, patterns, or shared responsibility. It is easier and more familiar to point than to redesign. The medieval habit of living under constant evaluation also shaped how people internalize failure. Failure once carried swift consequences, so people learned to hide it, minimize it, or redefine it as moral weakness. That fear still echoes in shame, secrecy, and the inability to openly experiment. Many people would rather stay stuck than risk visible failure, even when failure is now survivable. Even ambition is shaped by this inheritance. People aim for what feels achievable rather than what feels alive, because reaching too far once invited loss. The medieval world also left a mark on how people relate to silence within themselves. Inner quiet could allow doubt, grief, or forbidden thoughts to surface, so distraction became a form of safety. That reflex remains in constant mental noise, where stillness feels uncomfortable, and introspection is avoided unless structured or guided. Many people are strangers to their own inner landscapes, not because they lack depth, but because silence was once unsafe. What all of these remnants share is that they are not mistakes. They are successful adaptations that outlived their environment. Medieval humanity learned how to survive instability with extraordinary ingenuity. The tragedy is not that those lessons were learned, but that they were never consciously unlearned. And so they persist as invisible constraints, shaping choices, fears, and limits long after the danger passed. The medieval age did not just build walls around cities, it built walls inside minds, and the slow work of the present is not to tear those walls down violently, but to notice where they no longer serve, to test their necessity, and to gently step beyond them, because the moment someone realizes that many of their limits are echoes rather than truths, something loosens, the corridor widens, the breath deepens, and history, for the first time in a long while, begins to release its grip, not because it is forgotten, but because it is finally understood. And even when that widening begins, there remains a final, almost invisible medieval habit, the belief that life must be justified. In medieval worlds shaped by scarcity and judgment, existence alone was not enough. One had to earn one's place through usefulness, obedience, faith, or endurance. That belief settled so deeply into human consciousness that many people today still feel an unspoken pressure to explain themselves, to justify why they rest, why they change, why they choose differently, why they want more or less than expected. Simply being is rarely felt as sufficient. This is why many people feel uneasy during unproductive days, anxious during pauses, or guilty during moments of ease. The medieval reflex whispers that stillness must be defended, that freedom must be rationalized, that happiness must be earned. Even self-acceptance is often framed as something to work toward, rather than something to allow. There is also a lingering medieval relationship with comparison. In tightly bound hierarchies, comparison was constant. Who had favor, land, safety, protection? Knowing one's position mattered for survival. That instinct persists today in social comparison that feels compulsive, rather than chosen. People measure progress, worth, and identity against others, even when those comparisons serve no real purpose. This reflex is not vanity. It is an inherited orientation toward ranking in environments where rank once meant safety. Even success can feel unstable when it is measured externally, because medieval success was always temporary, dependent on forces beyond one's control. That instability still shadows achievement, making people anxious even when they are doing well. The medieval past also shaped how people relate to trust. Trust was risky, betrayal could be fatal. As a result, guardedness became wisdom. That caution remains today in how slowly people open, how quickly they retreat, how carefully they reveal themselves. Vulnerability feels dangerous not because it is, but because it once was. Even intimacy is often negotiated, controlled, and delayed, as if closeness requires constant assessment. Many people crave connection while simultaneously fearing it, caught between modern longing and medieval defense. There is, too, a medieval echo in how people treat change in others. Sudden change once signaled instability or threat, so communities learn to police deviation. That instinct still appears when people react uneasily to transformation, when someone grows, shifts identity, leaves a familiar role. Even positive change can provoke discomfort, because it disrupts the sense of predictability that once ensured safety. The medieval world prized consistency over growth. That value quietly survives, shaping expectations that people should remain recognizable, manageable. And the same, what emerges, layer by layer, is a picture not of an outdated era, but of an unfinished transition. Humanity moved outward, technologically, socially, materially, but inwardly, many medieval reflexes remained intact. The world became safer faster than the nervous system could update. And so people live in a strange in-between state, surrounded by choice, yet guided by instincts built for confinement, offered possibility, yet oriented toward caution. And even beyond that frontier, there are still faint medieval traces hiding in places people rarely question. One is the instinct to moralize outcomes, to believe that good things happen to good people, and suffering must indicate failure, impurity, or lack of effort. In medieval life, this belief offered a sense of order in a chaotic world. If misfortune had meaning, then chaos was less terrifying. That temporary psychological comfort hardened into a lasting habit of self-blame and judgment. Today, people quietly interrogate themselves when things fall apart, asking what they did wrong, rather than asking what simply happened. Even success can feel morally charged, creating guilt rather than relief. The medieval mind needed causality to survive randomness, but the modern world still inherits that reflex, even when randomness no longer threatens survival. Another echo lives in the fear of being replaceable. In medieval hierarchies, losing one's role could mean starvation or exile. So usefulness became synonymous with safety. That belief persists today when people fear slowing down, resting or stepping away, convinced that their value disappears the moment they stop producing. Even love is sometimes filtered through usefulness. Being needed feels safer than being chosen. The medieval habit of equating worth with function quietly survived inside relationships, workplaces, and self-image. There is also a lingering medieval suspicion of pleasure. Pleasure was regulated because excess threatened discipline and order, especially in societies already struggling to survive. That regulation seeped inward, becoming an internal censor that questions enjoyment unless it is productive, educational, or deserved. Many people still feel compelled to explain why something they enjoy is good for them, as if pleasure alone were insufficient justification. The medieval world feared excess because it invited instability. Modern life often inherits that fear without the danger. Even creativity carries this residue. Art was permitted when it served religion, power, or morality, not personal exploration. Today, many people hesitate to create unless there is an audience, a purpose, or validation, struggling to allow creativity to exist simply because it wants to. The medieval past also shaped how people relate to silence with others. Pauses in conversation once signaled danger or disapproval, so speech became a way to maintain safety. That reflex remains, making silence awkward rather than intimate, something to fill rather than inhabit. Even the need to constantly explain oneself, to justify choices, paths, or boundaries, echoes a time when deviation required defense. Modern people often over-explain, not because they owe clarity, but because ancestors once did. What emerges from all of this is not a story of backwardness, but of endurance. Medieval humanity did not fail to imagine a freer life. It simply could not afford to live it. And so it passed down caution disguised as wisdom, restraint disguised as maturity, and endurance disguised as virtue. The danger now is not that these instincts exist, but that they go unrecognized, quietly shaping lives that no longer require such armor. The past is patient. It waits inside habits until someone notices. And when they do, there is often a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that something was never wrong with them. Sorrow for how long they lived under rules written for another century. The medieval age lingers not because people refuse to move on, but because moving on requires noticing that many inner limits are inherited, not chosen. And once that noticing begins, the grip of history slowly loosens, not through force, but through understanding, compassion, and the simple realization that survival is no longer the highest achievement life asks for. And still there are quieter residues, almost imperceptible, that shape how people orient themselves toward the world. One is the inherited habit of bracing for judgment. In medieval societies, judgment was constant, by neighbors, clergy, rulers, and God. And it carried real consequences. That vigilance trained people to monitor themselves continuously, anticipating criticism before it arrived. Today, even in relative freedom, Many people rehearse explanations in their minds, preemptively defending choices no one has challenged. This anticipatory self-surveillance often passes as responsibility or self-awareness, but its roots lie in a time when being misunderstood could be dangerous. Alongside this sits the medieval fear of being out of order. Order was survival, social order, moral order, cosmic order. Anything that disrupted it threatened collapse. That fear persists today in discomfort with messiness, emotional messiness, non-linear lives, ambiguous identities, unfinished processes. People rush to tidy narratives, to resolve uncertainty, to appear coherent, because disorder still feels unsafe at a deep level. Even healing is often forced into timelines and stages, as if pain must behave properly to be acceptable. Another subtle inheritance is the belief that authority must be external. Medieval people relied on visible authority because chaos was lethal. Internal freedom was a luxury few could afford. That pattern survived, leaving many people uneasy when there is no clear rule, path, or permission. Freedom can feel disorienting rather than empowering, because the nervous system was trained to respond to commands, not open space. Even choice itself can feel burdensome, producing anxiety rather than relief. The medieval mind did not practice choosing, it practiced complying in order to live. That compliance later disguised itself as prudence, realism, or humility. There is also the lingering medieval relationship with time, not just urgency, but the sense that life is something to be endured sequentially, step by step, rather than inhabited expansively. Time was once a threat, winters killed, delays starved, waiting was dangerous. That legacy lingers in impatience, in the feeling that life is always slipping away, that one must hurry to be worthy before time runs out. Even moments of peace can feel haunted by clocks, and beneath all of this lies perhaps the most persistent medieval echo, the quiet belief that humans are fundamentally fragile and must be tightly managed. Medieval systems were built on that assumption because fragility was real. But modern life inherited the management without questioning the premise. Institutions, routines, and inner voices still treat people as if they cannot be trusted with freedom, rest, or ease. And so many lives are lived smaller than necessary, not because of lack of opportunity, but because of inherited caution. The medieval world taught humanity how to survive under constant threat. That lesson was invaluable, but survival knowledge, when mistaken for universal truth, becomes a ceiling rather than a foundation. The long echo of the medieval age is not suffering itself, but the belief that suffering is inevitable, instructive, and somehow necessary. And the quiet work of the present, slow, unglamorous, and deeply human, is to notice which fears belong to now, and which are relics of winters that ended long ago. There is also a medieval residue in how people relate to uncertainty itself. In medieval life, uncertainty was lethal. Unknown crops, unknown rulers, unknown beliefs could mean starvation or death. So the mind learned to treat the unknown as an enemy. That reflex never fully softened. Even today, many people feel deep discomfort, not because something is wrong, but because something is undefined. Ambiguity triggers anxiety, urgency, and overthinking, pushing people to label, decide, or resolve prematurely. This is why many cling to plans, identities, or explanations, even when they no longer fit. Certainty feels safer than truth. The medieval instinct to close possibilities quickly still shapes how people choose careers, relationships, and beliefs, often mistaking early closure for maturity. Another quiet inheritance lies in how people experience powerlessness. Medieval people had very little control over their circumstances, so resignation became a coping strategy. Acceptance was survival. Over time, that resignation was moralized into patience, humility, and endurance. Today, many people still default to endurance when change is possible, interpreting discomfort as something to tolerate, rather than a signal to adjust. They wait, adapt, and absorb far longer than necessary, not because they lack courage, but because endurance once kept ancestors alive. Even the modern fascination with grinding and hustling carries this imprint. Working harder feels safer than questioning the structure itself. The medieval world also shaped how people relate to mistakes. Error once carried harsh consequences, so avoidance became wisdom. That fear still echoes in perfectionism, procrastination, and paralysis. Many people delay action not because they lack motivation, but because their nervous system associates mistakes with danger rather than learning. Even learning itself is often framed as correction rather than exploration, echoing a time when deviation invited punishment. The medieval suspicion of deviation also lives on in how societies respond to difference. Anything that stood out once risked destabilizing fragile systems, so conformity was enforced. That enforcement survives today in subtle pressures to normalize behavior, desires, appearances, and timelines. Even when diversity poses no threat, people still learn to compress themselves to fit expectations, calling it adaptation rather than loss. There is also a lingering medieval relationship with hope. Hope was dangerous when disappointment could break morale in already brutal conditions, so it was tempered, postponed, or placed in distant futures. That habit persists today as cautious optimism, delayed dreams, and the belief that happiness must wait.